Something happened to me that's never happened before. Something was said to me that's never been said to me. I was told, Brady, we want you to preach longer today. Apparently, they got held up cooking last night with the rain, and so I'm going to relish this. I can't decide how much I'm going to let Jesus take the wheel versus how much I'm going to nervous ramble, but you guys are in for a treat. We had some technical difficulties this morning. That's why we got to a late start, so I don't know how much time I'm going to get to go, but I appreciate Adam is running the sound this morning. He's never done that before. That's not to out him, but it's to actually to applaud him. Sometimes there's an opportunity or a job, and we say, oh, at church that needs to happen, or in ministry that needs to happen. We say, oh, that's not really my skill set, or oh, let me pray about it first. But Adam just said, man, I'll step in and do it. I'll take over. So sometimes it's not, your calling is wherever the opportunity is. It's not about your skill set. And so I appreciate Adam stepping in and learning how to do this on the fly. So looking at this story, this last temptation, the devil takes Jesus up to a high mountain, and he shows him all the kingdoms of the world. And every time in Matthew that they're on a mountain, there's some kind of dealing with power and authority. Mountains are associated with power and authority, and that's what's at stake this morning. And really, if to a early someone living in Jesus' time and reading this going onto a mountain would make them think about Moses on Mount Nebo. God taking Moses to Mount Nebo and showing him all of Israel, that all of this would be given to him. And so there's an association there, and that's going to come into play later. So keep that in the back of your mind. But if he's really seeing all the kingdoms of the world, either it's being figurative and it just means a lot of the kingdoms, or if it's really all the kingdoms, he's at some kind of like in this picture, some kind of ethereal place. We don't really know. But Satan's saying, I'm going to give it all to you. If you worship me, I'll give it all to you. And my heart just sinks at the thought of Jesus doing something like that. But I think one of the interesting questions that students have asked me in the past, and I think it's a good question, is did Satan really have the authority to give these things to him? Did Satan really have dominion? Did he have any kind of possession of these kingdoms at all? And the answer is yes. Yeah, Satan really had some power there. He wasn't just, maybe he was lying about part of it, but Satan had some real dominion. He has some real power over these kingdoms. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2 calls him the ruler of the kingdom of the air. 2 Corinthians 4:4 calls him the God of this age. And it says that same God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers. John 12:31 calls him the prince of this world. So all these verses are acknowledging that Satan or evil, whatever you want to call it, has some kind of reign on earth, has some kind of power. So really, wherever you see selfishness, greed, abuse, you can see the influence of Satan and evil. Now, it doesn't mean Satan has the absolute power. We know who holds the ultimate victory. But in one way or another, evil and Satan has had its influence on this earth. It's done its damage. Now, that doesn't mean you can make an excuse and say, well, the devil made me do it. You can't weasel out of responsibility by blaming that. And you also you don't have to look for the devil under your bed or anything like that. But there is some influence there. And so essentially what he's telling Jesus, if you bow and worship me, I will give up whatever I'm doing. Now, I don't know if he'd really do it or not, but he's saying, I'm gonna quit. I'm gonna give up my influence. I'm gonna quit messing things up. I'm gonna quit fighting. I'm gonna leave it be. And so really what was going on here is if Satan's saying he's going to fold, basically what he's offering Jesus, whether he knows it or not, I don't know if Satan knew Jesus' ultimate mission was to die. I don't think Satan knew that. But ultimately what he is offering him is a way off of the cross. I'll just fold right now and you don't have to go suffer on the cross. So basically he's offering him another way. Instead of defeating Satan through suffering, cut a deal. Cut a deal with Satan. Just worship him. You can get all of that. No suffering, no cross, none of that. I think this one may have been one that was tempting to him because we see the fear of the cross. We see when he prays in the garden that this is not something he's excited about. This is something that haunts him. This is something he's terrified of. And you can see, and in this case, he responds, he says, "Get away from me, Satan." This is the time where it seems almost more of an emotional reaction than some of the other ones. Get away from me. And there's another time where he says that, something similar. But he says it to Peter in Matthew 16. Peter in Matthew 16 tells Jesus, you should never die. You don't need to die. You don't need to suffer. He's basically telling him, Jesus, you don't need to go to the cross. And Jesus tells Peter, get behind me, Satan. And so to me, I think I think he knows Satan's trying to pull me away from my mission. And so that's why he calls Peter that in that moment, because it's really, like we've been talking about, is these temptations that he's facing. They're like the formal prelude to the temptations he's going to face in his ministry. This isn't the only time he's going to be tempted with these things with Satan in this like formal temptation. In fact, Luke ends the story of the temptation with saying the devil went to wait for another opportune time. So these things are repeat temptations. And I think Jesus had a repeat temptation to find some way to weasel out of going to the cross. And I think it was one that probably did haunt him. And so here, Satan's tempting him with power. With power. And by power this morning, as we talk about power, I mean the ability to get your way. The ability to control others. The ability to influence people in the way you want them to be influenced. The ability to manipulate people. We're all tempted by power to one extent or another. But for Jesus and maybe for us, a lot of times, and maybe we don't always see it, but we want power to prevent suffering, to avoid suffering, which sounds great on paper, but I think there's something wrong with that, and I want to unpack that a little bit this morning. Suffering is part of the human experience, and it's a demon that we must face. Sometimes it's a demon that we must face that is the way we actually sort out suffering. It's something that we have to wrestle with. We don't like to experience pain or ridicule or rejection or loss, but it's going to happen. Like it or not, suffering is part of our life, and it does shape who we are. We're all going to grieve a loved one. At some point, you're going to have to grieve a loved one. Suffering through grief it's a consequence of love. If you love someone, you're going to have to face grief. Because we are finite beings, nothing lasts forever. Our bodies will age. We will lose some of the abilities that we used to have. People are going to pass on. We'll have to say goodbye. Nothing lasts forever, and we are going to experience loss, and with that comes suffering. But that's good. It's good that nothing here lasts forever, because we have a hope of something beyond this. So you can try to avoid suffering. And our culture is pretty good at that. We all try it. And that's often as we avoid suffering, as we refuse to acknowledge it, as we compartmentalize the pain in our life, to kind of try to set it aside. As we push it down and pretend that it's not there. We ignore it. We don't deal with some of the trauma and the pain from our past. It actually becomes an inner demon. This unresolved, unaddressed suffering and pain in our life becomes this inner demon. And when we don't deal with it, that inner demon, it comes out in these negative ways. Through anger that might just seem like it's out of nowhere. Maybe sleep issues, nightmares, anxiety. Maybe a feeling of numbness. As we learn to block out things that bother us, we learn to block out and not feel pain and not grieve. We train our minds and our bodies to be numb. And with that numbness comes emotional distance in relationships, maybe even a distrust of others, and other emotional issues. We live in a world where there are all kinds of ways to numb pain, whether it be prescription drugs or other forms of drugs and alcohol. You can veg out on your phone. I think another real common one, maybe for a lot of us in here, is busyness. If I'm busy and working and moving all the time, then I don't have to address these painful things in my life. I can block those out and set them to the side as I get busy. And so I want to ask you this morning, are you numbing something? There's something you're numbing, and how are you doing that? Is there some pain or some suffering or some trauma that you've been bearing and kind of need to deal with? Maybe it was a wound from your childhood, something a parent or a friend did or said. Maybe you haven't grieved a loss like you really need to. Our culture's not very good at grieving. It's something we could do better at, and I think we would be more complete. I think there would be less mental health issues if we learned to grieve a little bit better, to make more space for that in our lives. I've talked to a lot of adults who are just now coming out and dealing with unspoken suffering and trauma and issues from childhood. They're just now dealing with it. And when they bring that into the light, just saying, hey, this happened to me. Hey, this is how I was wounded. Just speaking it to somebody, there's some healing in that. That goes a long way. That's more helpful than you might think. So I'll ask you this: is there some pain that you need to speak into the light? Is there some pain that you're struggling with that you really need to share with somebody? And the church can help with that. I'd like to think that the church can be a safe place to share some of those things. Reengage might be a safe place to share some of those things. You might also go to counseling. And I know I want to normalize counseling for you. I know sometimes there's some stigma. They're like, oh, if you're going to see a counselor, you're like weak or whatever. And that is not the case. I think if you are going to see a counselor, it makes you brave. You're brave. It makes you brave enough to face the things that maybe you don't want to face. Brave enough to talk about the things that are hard to talk about. Brave enough to be humble. Brave enough to be humble and say, I need some outside help dealing with this. I need someone to help me work through these things. So that's not weak, it's strong. You're strong, you're brave if you're willing to go to counseling, and some of you may need to do that. And if that is something you're interested in, we got some great recommendations for you. But if we can face our pain and our suffering, not push it to the side, not try to pretend it's not there, but I think when we really face it and deal with it, I believe it'll make us more complete people, more alive, less numb, more willing to experience the world and life, less hypocritical because we're not living lies. We'll have less things to hide. And I think in doing that, when we address these things that we'd rather not, we become better friends, better spouses, and better disciples. So I think it is important to face some of these things. Another thing that I find interesting about kind of the association of suffering and power is suffering reminds us of our powerlessness. It kind of stands as this example that you don't have absolute control. Because, I mean, honestly, if we had power, we would avoid the suffering, right? If I had the power to stop myself from feeling this pain or stop my loved ones from feeling this pain, I would stop it. And so a natural part of grieving a loss or an accident, sometimes replay that event in your mind. I did it with the loss of my mom. I've been doing it with my daughter tearing her ACL. Is you kind of think through what could have done differently. What could I have done differently? If I just made that phone call, or if I was just there, if I just didn't allow this to happen. You know, with my daughter's ACL, I was like, we just had to play soccer. And I just had to tell her how well she was playing. You know, like I feel like if I was a really bad dad and was just like, Layla, you're not very good, just go sit this out, I would have saved her ACL. Woulda, shoulda, coulda, right? But when you do that, especially when you replay in your mind what could have gone differently to save this person or prevent that event from happening, you're still trying to save that person. But you can't. It's in the past. And you're powerless. And there's some humility in that. It's humbling. And when you acknowledge it, that was in the past. You must now, in an act of, I know being powerless makes us feel weak. But once you accept what happened, you must now, in an act of great strength, deal with that and go through that suffering. Deal with that grief. And they say grief is something you don't get over, you get through it. And so as you deal with these things that life throws at you that you don't have the power to prevent, you got to put on your big boy pants and take it on, and take on that suffering in strength. And that's what Jesus was choosing to do here. I'm not going to avoid the suffering. I'm not going to use power to get out of it. I'm going to take it on. And I know this idea of using power to prevent the suffering of others sounds very loving. And I think we try to do that in a lot of ways, right? We try to build up, have as much money as possible so that if any catastrophe comes, we can bail out our family and they're not going to have to suffer and we're not going to have to eat ramen noodles. You can make all kinds of plans to make sure that like these bad things don't happen. We all try to do that, right? We try to control our lives enough to prevent bad things from happening. There's nothing really wrong with that. But sometimes it can go too far. Sometimes it can become a little bit misguided. I've had a friend mention this, and I think this is a great analogy of we have a lot of helicopter parents in here. We're all guilty of this. But some of us are lawnmower parents. A lawnmower parent is a parent who goes out in front of the kid and just mows down all the problems so that they can just walk through life super easy. They've set the stage for them. There's nothing to worry about. There's not going to be any problems, no challenges. It's going to be super easy. And so, some examples of this, you might make sure your kid's on the really good team. I'm going to put them on the really good team and make sure that they never have to experience losing. Or I'm going to redshirt them and make sure they're older and bigger than all the other kids so they'll be able to dominate. I'm going to do all their homework for them, write their essays for them, or at least do some really good editing. Make sure they ace school, no problem. I'm going to schedule all their social events for them so that they're never going to get into trouble and they're going to be with the safe and the right people, and make sure that I'm kind of right there so that I can make sure everything's okay and make sure that there's not any trouble. I'm going to remove them from any difficult activities that are too challenging where they're not at the top. If they got a hard teacher, I'll just get them a schedule change. I'm going to monitor their diet to make sure that they're healthy. I'm going to track them on their phones and make sure they never go anywhere unsafe. These are things that, I say we are guilty of. They're loving things. They're good things. But how far is too far, right? Because what we do when we do that is we're setting them up for failure once we're not there to hold their hand and pave the way for them. So it's not as loving as it feels. And even though I think we do this, we're very well-meaning. There's space for some of these things. I'm not saying, don't monitor your kids, okay? I think that's important to do that. But we set them up for failure when we become too controlling. And when sometimes we become so controlling in an act of love to try to protect them, to try to bless them. But it becomes so controlling it doesn't feel like love. It becomes so controlling that you might become resented. You might have kids resenting you. And so I could have prevented my daughter from tearing her ACL. I could have locked her in her basement. She'd never experienced pain or suffering or rejection, heartbreak. Wouldn't that be great? We don't have a basement. I could dig a hole. I would give you an air hole. I could do that. And it would prevent a lot of issues. She wouldn't have to suffer. But that wouldn't be loving. There'd be no freedom. There'd be no joy. She wouldn't feel loved by me. It would not be a loving thing to do. It would not be to be so controlling to not allow your kids to live life, to lock them in the basement. You might think it's loving because it's protecting them, but it's not. Some of us are mad at God for not doing that same thing. Some of us are mad at God for not locking us in a basement, not letting us feel anything. But the reality is, it's loving to let us live a little bit, to let us have free will. Power, it offers an easy substitute for the hard task of love. It's easier to control people than it is to love them sometimes. It's easier to be God, to make myself God, than love God. Easier to own life than love life. Ever since we were tempted in the garden, we've been tempted to replace love with power and control. But here, as we look at the example of Jesus, the way of the Christian is not upward mobility like the world pursues. but downward mobility, away from power, which leads to suffering and ultimately led Jesus to the cross. So as Christians, we refuse to take control and manipulate. We refuse to do that. God refuses to do that. Jesus refuses to do that. And with that is going to come some suffering. So as Christians, we abandon power in favor of love. We abandon power in favor of love. It would have been so sad to see Jesus bow to Satan. Oh, my stomach turns thinking of that. It would break my heart. I'm glad he didn't give in. To give up what he stands for. To gain power just to avoid suffering. He would have been powerful. But what a weak move. That would have been a weak move to gain power. He would have given up who he is, given up his values, given up his standards. Have you done that? Have you given up a little bit of who you are, a little bit of your values, a little bit of your morals, a little bit of your own standards for a little bit of power, for a little bit of control, for a little bit of comfort, for a little bit of status, a little bit of pain avoidance? Where have you weakly accepted power? There are a lot of weak people who have power. And sometimes that power allows them to be weak. But Jesus redefines what strength looks like. You can be strong without this power, without this control, without this ability to manipulate others. You can have strength without power. And Jesus shows us that. Jesus redefines what strength is. Strength isn't avoiding suffering. It isn't using power to manipulate things in your favor. It's facing the suffering. It's taking it on. So someone in here, I know a lot of you are struggling. A lot of you are suffering right now. And you may think you're suffering because of a failure, because you messed up. You may think you're suffering because you're weak. You may think that because you hurt, or because you grieve, because you cry, because you mourn, you might think that makes you weak. But you're taking on that suffering. You're facing it. You are strong. If you're trudging through suffering right now, if you're taking it on, you are strong. You are brave. You're walking in the narrow path of Jesus, who doesn't avoid the suffering. He takes it on. So you look like Jesus as you face suffering. And he's suffering with you. He walks with you in the suffering. He's a man who knows suffering. And so it's interesting, for this last temptation, Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 6:13. And if you look at let's look at it in a little more context here. That's probably hard to read. Let's see. It says, when the Lord your God has brought you into the land that he has swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you a land with fine, large cities that you didn't build, houses filled with all sorts of goods that you did not fill, hewn cisterns that you did not hew, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, when you have eaten your fill, take care that you don't forget the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The Lord your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve. And by his name alone you shall swear. So verse 13 is what he quotes there. But I think the context is actually really important here. Again, it's a reference to the Israelites being in the wilderness, preparing to go into the promised land. All the verses he quotes tie back to the wilderness, to the wilderness wanderings. Because what's going on here is all tied to it. And it's a reminder to, hey, when you go in there, don't forget about God. Don't worship other gods. What I really thought was interesting here is that the fuller text, it's about God giving people the kingdoms, the cities, the homes, the food. And so Satan's offering him all these kingdoms, but subtly, without even saying it, without even quoting the whole text, Jesus is reminding us. He's reminding the reader. It's really God who gives these things. And God will give them in his time and on his terms. It's saying it's really God who has the ultimate victory. It's really God who provides. And he will do so in his time. And I will wait, and I will trust. And I will take what God gives me, not what you offer, Satan. I'll accept the things that are outside of my control. I think that is an important human thing that we must learn. We need to learn to accept the things that we do not have control over and turn that over to God. I think that's been a theme in Re-Engage, spoken in different ways. There are some things that we just have to leave to God and accept and quit trying to meddle in affairs that are above us. So it's saying I will refuse to try and take control of these things outside of me. But also, God has the victory. So as Christians, we operate not from a place of despair or defeat, but from a place of victory. We have hope in a God who suffers for us and with us, who is present with us in suffering, but who has already won, who has already given all, whose love knows no boundaries, and who will make all things new and all things right. I really believe that. As we wrestle and trudge through life, as we struggle with why God does what he does, as we struggle with why these things happen to us, I really do believe there will be a time when it will be made sense out of. God will make all things new and right. We're going to offer an invitation now, which is weird. I know that's not traditional. That's not the way we normally do it. But we'll offer an invitation now, and we'll sing a song and sing a song or two, and then we're going to move into communion. But if you do want to give your life to Christ, or if you need prayers, if there is anything you need from the body of Christ now, we will make space for that. We will make time for that. So if you have any need, we invite you to come now as together we stand and sing.